Welcome to everyone on this side. Thank you. Welcome to the West Falmouth Library. We are now at capacity. If nobody else walks in the door. This is a wonderful turnout for a very important event this evening. I'm Pam Olson, the library director, and this is a collaboration with the West Falmouth Village Association, and Martha Ross is here this evening representing that group, and Annie Saganik from Falmouth Housing Trust. And I'm going to let Martha say a few words. However, please turn off all electronic devices. Please know that restrooms are through that way or back and around. It could be an interesting passage right now that you can use in that way. And thanks again for coming.
I just want to welcome you from the Sue Moran, unfortunately, who is our president of the West Falmouth Village Association, is unable to be with us tonight, and I just welcome you. We are all here for a very important reason to find out what's happening. So welcome, and I do have, for any of you who are not members of the association, I do have membership forms in the back. $15 a year keeps you in tune with what's going on. So we'd love to have you join us if you're not already. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Annie Saganik. I'm the executive director for the Falmouth Housing Trust. If I'd have known that I was going to get so many people out for the FEMA firm bloodbaths, I would have been saying we're having talks all the time, and you would come and you would say, oh, this isn't about firm or FEMA. This is a great turnout. We're really, really pleased. Like the lady said, this is a collaborative event between the Housing Trust, the West Falmouth Library, and the West Falmouth Village Association. Just a few things to note. Please make sure your phones are off, because that's annoying. Secondly, this is designed to be an informational community presentation. So try to make your questions broad in scope, not very specific about your yard specifically or your basement. And this is informational only. So if you are in the floodplain and you do have big questions and big problems and big expenses coming up, you might want to make an appointment with a professional. But right now, I will take a second and introduce our panel. We have Eladio Gore here, who is the building commissioner for the town of Falmouth. We also have Bob Shea, who's the GIS coordinator for the town of Falmouth, manning the PowerPoint slides. We have Addie Drolette, who's a senior loan officer with Rockland Trust. She's here to sort of talk to you a little bit about lenders, frankly, and what their role in this is and how it's going to trigger compliance, and you're going to hear more about that. And then we have Douglas MacDonald from Murray McDonald Insurance. He's going to obviously pick up the insurance side of things, give some brief points. We're going to try to keep the presentations quick, moving quickly, and then we're going to have an extended Q&A session, okay? So if you think of something, make a note, tell your neighbor to remind you if you forget, like I do, and then we'll do the questions then, okay? Thanks so much. Here's Eladio.
Again, my name is Eladio Gore. I'm the building commissioner for the town of Falmouth. I'm going to talk briefly about what are some of the implications of the changes in the map with regard to construction. And the others will talk about other aspects, insurance and things like that. But with regard to construction, one of the most important documents that you will need, if you don't already have it, and if you haven't had it done recently, you would need to have it done again, and that is the elevation certificate. This elevation certificate is done by a certified land surveyor. And what they will do is they'll actually come out to your site and do a survey and make a determination as to what flood zone you're in and whether or not the structure is in compliance with the requirements for the flood zone regulations. So they'll determine whether or not your lowest floor is in compliance, whether or not the structure has been elevated sufficiently based on the flood zone that you are going to be in once these maps become in full force and effective. What basically has happened is the elevations themselves have risen. So even if you know already that you're in a flood zone, that's not going to be enough, because in all likelihood, the elevation at your property is going to rise somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 feet. So you may be currently in a flood zone and your structure may be currently in compliance. However, when those maps change, you may not be. And that's where the elevation certificate will identify that and also identify what is not in compliance, what is in compliance. If your property is in a flood zone, it doesn't necessarily mean that your home is in the flood zone or that it's not in compliance. Your entire property may not be in the flood zone, even if you live on the water. So your house could be situated on that property so that it is out of the flood zone. Again, the land surveyor will be able to identify that for you. So you may be fine even with the changes to the map. You may still be okay. Your home and structure may be just fine. In some cases, you currently may not be in a flood zone. With the changes of the map, many areas are now going to be captured in the flood zone, either an A zone or a B zone. And those are the two zones that are of concern, A zone or B zone. The A zone is a situation where the floodwaters will rise to a certain level. The V zone, the floodwaters will rise to a certain level, but you will also get velocity waves that will then be more destructive to the property. And so that's the most restrictive or the worst flood zone is the V zone, which has the velocity waves. Again, the elevation certificate will give you all of that information. So you want to get that if you have any questions or concerns. Now, if you do discover that you are in a flood zone, or that the flood zone that you're in now makes your structure non-compliant, there are a number of things that you can do, and we are not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about what those things are. But you can certainly come into the building department and discuss that, or discuss those with a qualified contractor who is familiar with flood zone construction and retrofitting of houses in the flood zone. I just brought one sample. These are flood vents. This happens to be a smart vent. And what it's designed to do is, it is designed to automatically allow the water to enter and to exit if it were in a crawl space or a basement area. So you might be able to just retrofit your home with those and help to bring it into compliance, or at least help to minimize the effects of the floodwaters on your structure. And especially if you have a block foundation, these are very easy to install into the block foundation and allow the water, when it does come up, to be able to flow in and out without causing damage to your structure. Hydrostatic pressures and other uplift, buoyancy, and all those kinds of things can be eliminated by inserting those into the foundation. Again, those are technical things. If you need to know more about that, please come in to see us, or again, talk with a qualified contractor. So if you have an existing house and you want to put an addition on, and you find that you're now in the flood zone, under the state building code, there are certain requirements that would trigger having to elevate the structure. And the rule of thumb is 50% of the assessed value of the structure. So if you're going to remodel your home, and let's just use round numbers for the sake of discussion, $100,000, and you want to remodel, the house is assessed at $100,000, you want to do a major renovation. That renovation is going to cost you $90,000. That's more than 50% of the assessed value. Under the state building code, you are then required to bring the entire building into compliance with the flood zone requirements. That may mean elevating, it could mean eliminating a basement if you have one. It could mean installing the smart vents or any number of things. If this is just a lateral addition, then, and the lateral addition is going to be more than the assessed value, then just the lateral addition would have to conform, not the entire house. So again, those are technical things. If you have specific questions, please come in to see us or or talk with someone who's qualified, a qualified builder who's done work in a flood zone. And I can't emphasize that enough. You want to make sure that you have a qualified land surveyor who's doing the elevation certificates and identifying what flood zone you're in, what the elevation is on the ground where your house is. Because again, you could be in the flood zone, but the house could be out of it, and therefore you wouldn't even be affected at all. So many of you may be worrying for nothing because your house may be out of the flood zone even under the new maps. But some of you have legitimate concerns because a lot of Falmouth is going to be affected by these new changes. So some areas that are not in the flood zone now will be in. Those areas that are in the flood zone, the elevations will be higher. And therefore, if you're going to build new, you're going to be elevated higher than perhaps you would have been if you built last year. If you're going to put an addition on, a lateral addition, then that addition would have to comply. If you're going to renovate the existing building and you're going to do more than 50% of the assessed value, that entire structure is going to have to comply, whether that means elevating or doing some other modifications to it. So the state building code regulates that. The elevation certificates will get you started and let you know just where you stand and what zone you're in and how you're going to be affected. So I'll wait till the end and answer any questions.
No, it's you. I'm up. Hi. I'm Addie Drolette, as Andy said. West Falmouth native, so I know this is affecting a lot of people. My family included has some concerns. We're living out in East Falmouth. I'm sorry, I hate these things. And I'm one of the lucky people that has a home on the water, that the home is not in the flood zone. It will not be in the flood zone, but I know I'm going to need a new elevation certificate. So I understand where you're all coming from, and I know it's going to cost a lot of people money to do that. I'm trying, sorry. Okay, I know. So I wanted to just touch about what lenders are going to be looking for from you folks if you have a mortgage or an equity loan on your property. because I think that's a major concern. But before I get into the details of that, I want to make sure you all understand what these National Flood Insurance Program is all about, because there's 3 federal agencies involved in this. The first one is FEMA, who creates the maps, does the analysis, and creates the maps. Then we have the National Flood Insurance Program, who writes the policies. And then we have the FDIC, that's the one who monitors the banks, who is the enforcement arm of these flood insurance policies. And so the FDIC is holding the banks accountable to make sure that the homeowners have that flood insurance in place. So that's how the banks end up getting involved in this. So I think you pretty much understand the basics of it. It's, the insurance is issued through NFIP, which is subsidized by the federal government. And the reason that we require the flood insurance now is because if you have a home with a mortgage on it and you lose the house and it's totally destroyed, and your mortgage has been sold to Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or FHA or VA, they're a federally subsidized agency. So they don't want to be caught short if you decide to default on your loan because you no longer have an insurable property or a property that you can reside in. So if you choose to walk away from your loan, it's usually a federal agency that's going to be hurt by it. So again, another reason why they make the banks require the flood insurance. We're the police, sorry guys, I hate to tell you that, but that's kind of the way it's panned out now. So the policy requirements are the minimum of replacement value of the dwelling, the amount of the mortgage. So if you have a small mortgage, you may not need to have more than your replacement value, but you're going to be required to have something, or a maximum of $250,000. So we go by the least resistance here. We don't want to make you insured for more than you need to. It may be prudent to insure it for more than the bank requires, but I'm just going to tell you about what the bank is requiring in this. So other than that, you get to the point where you're convinced your property's not in a flood zone, the bank's sending you the nasty letter saying you need insurance and you have 30 days to get it. What are you going to do? You going to agree to it, or do you want to appeal it? There is an appeal process. And this is the formal appeal process that the banks will accept if you want to try to get this requirement waived by your lender. It's called a LOMA letter, Letter of Map Amendment. The second type you can apply for, depending on your property, is the LOMA, LOMRF letter, which is a letter of map revised based on fill. If your property is in an area that had fill brought in at some point, and you want to apply, you do that through the application process. Part of the application process is going to require, as Eladio said, the elevation certificate. So you're going to go back and have to get a licensed land surveyor or a civil engineering firm to come out and help you complete that application, or you can have them complete the whole application. Those applications can be done online with FEMA. You can go right to FEMA.gov and find the application. There's actually a tutorial that I looked at the other day and said, oh, it's not so bad. If you want to try to save yourself some money by doing some of the work yourself, but you will need to have that elevation certificate. Once you have, if you're fortunate enough to get that, which I'm hoping I'm fortunate enough to get, so I'm pretty confident I'm not in it. Yeah, I wasn't in 1995, and Eladio needed an elevation certificate at that time too, so we'll get it again, hopefully. If you get that and you present it to your lender, you can have it waived. The requirement is waived, and we will document that. There are some lenders that are saying, well, we may require it anyway if there's any question about it. In my experience in 25 years of doing residential lending on the Upper Cape, Southeastern Mass, I've probably done 10 LOMAs with borrowers going through the application process. I've probably had 8 successful, and I've never had a lender that I worked for in my history reject the LOMA letter. So if you really feel strongly that you want to pursue this, I encourage you to do so. I can't speak for the cost of it, because I haven't done it in a while myself, but I'm going to be pursuing it. So if you have any questions down the road about it, feel free to contact me. I'll let you know how I'm making out with my appeal. And that's it for me. I think we're going to go to the insurance guys now, right?
Yep, Douglas.
Thank you.
Bob, was there anything you wanted to add? You had some slides up here before I get talking.
No, I'm all set. I'll fill in as we go along with the questions.
All right, so we'll move. We should just go ahead and click the next point there. I thought we'd start off for a moment there to talk about flood. What is the definition of the flood, and start there, because I hear people talk about flood zones and they'll call up and say, am I in a flood zone or not? And the answer always is yes, you are. All of Cape Cod is a flood zone. The question is, are you in a C, are you in an A or a B or what have you? But the government comes out and says, it can be a temporary condition, and it can just be 2 acres or 2 properties that get flooded, and you could that would be a definition of a flood. A flood is not if you have your washing machine hose break while you're on vacation and your house gets flooded out and the basement gets filled up. We've had those. We actually had one time somebody called up our agency and said, I think you insure this house. They're in Europe on vacation. It was the middle of January, and said there's water coming out the front door. And but that's not a flood. That is something different. So you could technically be at a higher elevation, and if you had a torrential downpour where there was no place for the water to go and it came into your property, that technically could be a flood. We'll just move on to the next one. NFIP, a lot of times, why are we even going through this? And the big answer to that question is, and this number varies from 15 to $30 billion, so I just thought I'd take the higher number for impact. But the NFIP is in debt about $30 billion. They're not exactly sure how much, but it's around that number. And, you know, the question is, well, how did we even get there to start with? In a sense, if you wanted to get flood insurance, there was never a market to provide this for you prior to 1968. Some companies would provide it, but there's never a guaranteed market out there. The flood insurance came into effect 1968. Town of Falmouth adopted the flood maps in 1974. And once that happened, if you ever notice, you take a look at a lot of the old houses on Cape Cod, were they big? No, most of the old houses, they weren't very big, because most people, when they financed those things, if it was near the water, they might have paid cash or took a mortgage against their secondary home. The big homes were from affluent people that could afford those things that were right on the water. In a sense, when flood insurance came out, they created their own problem, because once flood insurance was available, people could develop the coastal properties and build bigger homes. And it wasn't until Hurricane Andrew in I think it's 1992, when it came along and they realized, when it took out this wide swath of homes, they realized we've overdeveloped the coast, and insurance companies started to wake up to this and said, we've got a problem. And then you had Katrina come along in 2005, furthermore, and they found out that they had to do something about this. And there's a lot of actual shenanigans going on in terms of how the flood insurance was being rated. People could go to two different places and get two different quotes, even though it's the federal government providing it. And there was a lot of inaccuracies going on. And they're realizing that they need to get this thing correct. So their solution is they came up with what's called the Bigger Waters Flood Insurance Reform Act. It's 2012. And the big solution is, let's get it right. And one of the ways, as Eladio mentioned, to get it right is to get an elevation certificate. Get your facts first to see where your property is and where it's located. And then they wanted to take a look at some of the flood maps to see if they needed to be revised. Their whole goal in this process is to get it to be actuarially sound. So that if you buy a house and you live on the water, then you need to pay for your fair risk share of that property on there, and it shouldn't be subsidized by the federal government. When they came out with flood insurance in 1974 in the Falmouth area, you had houses that were what we call pre-firm. That meant they were built before the establishment of flood insurance rate maps. You might have heard the term FIRM. It's just an acronym, Flood Insurance Rate Map. And those houses that were already built, they figured they're doing them a favor, and they subsidized them. They offered them lower rates. A lot of these houses you might have seen might have been built at 5 feet above what they call base flood elevation. And if you were to build new construction, you'd have to have built it perhaps at 14 feet. And you're 9 feet below, and they realize it's not fair to make you pay that rate. So older houses were able to receive subsidized flood rates. For the most part, if I were to generalize, and if you take something away from this conversation tonight, it's most of the homes that are in what we call pre-firm, before the establishment of flood insurance rate maps, that are going to experience the greatest pain through this process. Those are the folks also that didn't have to provide an elevation certificate. Houses after 1974 had to provide an elevation certificate. So that's just to give you an idea about flood can happen anywhere, and they wanted to get it clarified. I just put a slide up. They can move on to the next one. But one of the problems you take a look at in terms of flood maps, I think it's interesting, this is what the old flood maps look at, and there's not a lot of detail there. And you could have people say, here's the flood zone right here. I'm not in the flood zone. And by definition, if a portion of your property is, or your house, your physical structure is in it, they put your whole house into it in terms of a rating component. But it allowed for a lot of difficulty in determining where exactly your property was. And then I don't know if any of you remember in 2005 when Hurricane Andrew hit along the south end, Biloxi, Mississippi, the governor and some of those places thought that they'd come up with something creative to get their floods covered. Does anybody remember what had happened? They said, you know what? How do you know it wasn't a flood? How do you know it wasn't the hurricane that first blew the house down, so it was actually wind damage? So we need you to pay, all you homeowner insurance companies need to pay it. And they said, well, contractually, you can't do that. And they ended up going to court, and they ruled in favor of the insurance company, saying, no, that was flood damage. But people tried to get creative because they didn't buy flood insurance. And That's part of the problem where now you're having the bankers saying, you know what, if you're gonna finance the property, and it's a Fannie Mae or a Freddie Mac backed loan, you have to have flood insurance. So click to the next one. So here you're taking a look at another flood map, and you can see a lot more detail. You even have the structures on the property, and it's very easy to define it. To quote my grandfather, he used to say, you know, get the facts first, and then argue with a vengeance. When you're dealing with flood insurance, get the facts first, get an elevation certificate. And particularly if you're buying or selling a piece of real estate property, I hear all sorts of stories out there. I'm not in a flood zone, or I'm not here, or I shouldn't pay that much. Get the flood elevation certificate, and if you have good engineers, sometimes you can argue your point. Addie mentioned about Lomar. Anyways, we'll move on to the next one. Give you an idea. We talk about base flood elevation. And what we're looking for is, you know, what are they calling? Here you get a red line and a red line up there. We're talking about the base flood. And they have, well, haven't gone into the definition, but that's the high water mark that the government is using in their flood maps. So in this particular case, you can see base flood elevation. The basement is completely above the base flood elevation, not a problem. And the next one, it's not a problem. John, go to the next slide. Again. But if you bring it up here, and you see the base flood elevation, it becomes a problem. And one of the things they talk about is if you have mechanicals down there in the room, that will mean you're in the flood zone now. And so what some people have done to mitigate is they've moved the mechanicals out of the basement, or they've filled in their basement. And as Eladio was showing you, they put these flood vents in there to get away from the flood component. So, as I've already mentioned earlier today, the best thing you can do is get an elevation certificate. If you're on the water and you have a complicated property, a lot of times we have to submit it to the NFIP, that's the National Flood Insurance Plan Program. And I have been experiencing about a 5-week delay on some properties. It's just up there. And if you can imagine, up and down the coast, the agency is being inundated, and they just can't handle the, so we get what's called tentative rates. But that's what we have to do. So, elevation certificate, get photographs of the property, submit it to them, they come back and they'll say this is what it's going to be. And you can talk to 5 different agencies out there, it's all going to be the same price because it's the federal government that in essence is the reinsurer of it. Next slide there. I put a couple of points up there for mitigation techniques. One of the best things you can do is elevate the building. And it's an expensive option, but it gets you out of the flood zone. Believe it or not, I have had, and people can chuckle about it, but I have had some people where the flood insurance, in fact, it's kind of an interesting story. I had a friend of mine call me up and he said, Doug, my wife wants to buy this house. It's on the property, it's on the water. I don't want it, can you help me out? And I go, well, what can I do? He goes, what's the flood insurance going to be? And so I got a little creative and I said, well, according to the new flood maps, and I went on, and because of technology today, you can go on to the building departments in a lot of towns and you can pull the assessor card and you can take a look at it, and it showed house was originally built in 1946, and then they materially improved it, as Eladio had talked about, more than 50% in 1994. And yet the flood insurance they had in force was still what they call a pre-firm rate. Somebody had inaccurately rated it. And so I said, oh, this is now subject to the new flood rates. Your premium's going to be $59,000. He didn't believe me. I submitted it to the NFIP, got all the information back, and I sent it back, and he said, wow, thank you very much. You helped me out. But that's not the news that most people want to hear. They want to go the other way. But if, some people, what they've done is they've materially improved their property, and on their flood insurance, it's still being listed as a pre-firm structure. And I've seen those things. And again, you have to get your facts first when you're dealing with this, particularly if you're buying or selling a property. Install flood venting. Eladio already talked to you about that. We've talked about, I had somebody who actually, they filled in their basement, put the flood vents in, and had all the mechanicals moved out of it, and kept their insurance very, very low. Breakaway walls. Those are things where when they elevate the structure, you'll sometimes see they'll put breakaway walls in. Obviously speak to the building department. There are, through FEMA, there are mitigation funds available, and there are resources, and you can go onto their webpage. I've gone through here pretty quickly to leave it open for questions. I don't believe there's another slide there. Yeah, I have it right there. So I will rush through quickly so we could have this open to questions, and I can take it from that point.
Okay. Hope everyone made their notes as requested. Thank you all. You did a great job. Very informative. The thing that's interesting for, obviously we're in West Falmouth. It's a historic district. A lot of the village now is suddenly in a flood zone. I am in a flood zone. We never were. Our house was built in 1840. Suddenly we're in trouble. So it's a little distressing. But also, I think not just this little village and other parts of town, a third of the properties in the town are now in a flood zone. A third. And a lot of those properties are municipally owned. And guess what that means? We, the taxpayers, are going to feel that. So it's an important issue, even if you're not, obviously, if your personal house isn't, it's a relief. But it's an issue that affects every one of us, so we should be paying attention. Okay, any questions? Yes, you.
How can we be confident that these flood maps are actually accurate? Because without accuracy, all this is meaningless.
Yes. Anyone want to take that?
I'll just make a comment. As a few speakers have mentioned, this is a nationwide update to the flood maps. And if you question their accuracy, you can hire an engineer and fight it. But other than that, they are what they are.
Well, wouldn't it be more efficient if FEMA went back and actually relooked at their conclusions just to verify? Why should it be up to the individual property owner to prove that it's a certain category?
They've been working on this. They've been working on this for.
It doesn't matter how long they were working on it. Was it done well to begin with? If they didn't use the right data, they didn't use the right methodology, we're all sitting here spinning wheels that really shouldn't have to be active.
I think, I share your frustration dealing with the federal government, believe me. But we're not able to really accurately answer that question, although Eladio is going to try.
There was an appeal period in which you could have appealed the preliminary maps. That appeal period has come and gone. So once the maps have been officially accepted, and we're anticipating a letter to that effect, most recently we've been told it's probably going to be February 7th. But once that happens, then the only recourse that you have is to hire a land surveyor or an engineer and file for a map revision for your particular property. Again, we understand the frustrations. We didn't make the maps. We didn't do the study. We are just charged with, unfortunately, enforcing it from the building department's perspective. So the maps are what they are. There have been some revisions made based on information that was provided during the appeal period, but that's been very, very limited. Most of them were not accepted, the information that was submitted. So they are what they are, and regardless of how we feel about them, these maps will become effective, and you'll have to deal with them as they are.
Okay. This man with the little peepers on his, you, yes, you. No, you, yeah.
The mitigation techniques. If I follow those mitigation techniques, how will they impact the premiums I pay on my flood insurance?
I figured somebody had asked me a question about premiums, and I'll talk a little bit about that. It depends, to answer your question. It simply depends. I talked about the pre-firm. So the houses that were built before 1974 being impacted the greatest. I'm just going to give a couple of examples here. It depends if it's a primary home or a secondary home. If you've already had flood insurance or you're getting it for the first time. But the maximum you can buy, does anybody know what that amount is? 250, yeah, if it's residential, it's $500,000. If it's commercial, then you get what's called excess coverage. But if here's somebody that was in the A zone, last year they paid $2,100. This year they're paying $2,600. It's a $500 increase. It was built after the establishment of flood insurance rate maps. I've had cases, to your point there, if they've done everything in terms of the mitigation, the biggest thing is have you moved the house out of the flood zone, and if you're in a velocity zone or not. But if you've moved it out, one of the properties we're working on right now, their insurance alone is over $50,000, and and it's a commercial property. They're going to have to raise it up about 14 feet. And you can say, like, wow, okay, that's kind of crazy, but he's going to try to get creative and put parking or do something underneath it, storage, what have you. The cost to buy the flood insurance at $50,000 is going to drop down to under $1,000 once he raises it up. And in essence, pays for itself. So it does depend.
Yes, you, Mr. with the green. Yeah.
Thank you. Congressman Keating has advocated that FEMA delay implementation, and he's written the op-ed page in the Globe and so forth. Any chance that that's likely to occur? Any sentiment about what Congress will do with this?
Repeat the question, please.
His question was whether or not that the maps are really going to go through, because there's been a lot of protests against him, including congressmen. As of yesterday, we were told by FEMA that they're going forward. That's all I can tell you.
Yes, Mr. Stripes.
Basic question, where can we see the maps?
The maps are available on the town's website, and we will, actually, thank you, because it's prompted me. We have some sign-up sheets in the back. If you want to leave your email address and your name, we can follow up with you and send you a link to the town site, which allows you to zoom in on your property, and then it will let you see.
Thank you.
Okay? Yes, Ms. Red.
To follow up on the question, if we're mandated to get insurance, can we get it no matter what, or do we have to be in compliance? Can you explain the process, I guess? I'm assuming that the first point of contact potentially for some of us will be our bank, right? And after that, if we're not in compliance or it takes time to get in compliance, I think we need to know what that process is.
So the question is, can you get flood insurance? That's the question she's asking. And the answer to your question, yes, you can buy flood insurance. Whether what you want to pay for it is another thing. It might be just not practical. And I am not exaggerating when I've seen this. I've seen it in 6-digit numbers, $100,000. And because they're looking at it, it's not a matter of if they're going to be flooded, it's when. And from an actuarial rating, it doesn't make sense. So people would have to apply some mitigation techniques to it to get the premiums to be reasonable.
Just to add to that, because if you receive a notice from your bank, typically you have 30 days to obtain the insurance. If you do not obtain the insurance, we will obtain it for you and send you a bill for it. And that's what we're required to do by law. So you'll get a mortgage payment that's now going to say, by the way, you owe us an extra $300 a month for your flood insurance premium, which we purchased. So there's no ignoring it. We have to do that.
I'm not actually ignoring it. It's the compliance issue, right? Of not everyone's going to be able to make it compliant right away, right?
And one other thing is, there are people that have borrowed money from private lenders and skirted the whole issue and just decided to self-insure the flood.
John?
I've read the federal government based the local flood zone on California. And I have an additional question. How can they be accurate? And I ask that because we happened to build a second home on West Falmouth Harbor 40 years ago. We don't have a mortgage. But the first thing we did was take elevations above where Hurricane Carol in 38 and in the 54 hurricane, and we made sure that we were above the floodplain by 5 feet, above the highest water had ever come in the last 100 years. Now this house is in the floodplain. This does not make any sense. I'd like to know, how much did they move up the floodplain in Falmouth or Buzzards Bay, whatever? That's what is going to interest all of us, because I don't know whether it's, you know, I know we were 10 feet above high water. Where did they go? Are they 20 feet? I mean, we allowed for this.
Bob, can you answer a little bit? Okay. The other thing too that I know that they did take into account is history, the increase in velocity, the strength of storms, and the intensity of the storms, and the frequency of the storms, and then also sea level rise, which is happening. But here, Bob.
I myself have read a couple articles that claim that they use specific models for New England. I have no idea if they did or not. And I don't know if even if they did, if they would be valid. There's a lot of bad information going around as well as good, and I don't know if that's good information or not. But I wouldn't suspect that they would use a Pacific model here in the Northeast. And if they did, they would have reason behind it. This is not just, like someone mentioned, they included history. And Eladio mentioned that the flood elevations have changed, they've gone up. One of the reasons it's gone up is because the datum has changed. The datum is a point of reference. The last one used the 27 and 29 datum, 1927, 1929. The new one used a more accurate datum, 83 and 88 on the vertical. So that actually brings you up a foot, almost a foot, right off the bat. The flood maps themselves are a compilation of models, histories, and I'm not sure everything that's included, but it's not just one study, it's a lot of data put together and developed, you get what this is. Like I said, if you disagree with it, you can hire an engineer.
I'd like to just follow up. I'm on the board of the Buzzards Bay Coalition, past chairman. We are very interested to find out how much did they change the level? 2 feet?
You should write a letter and ask that, because that's, I don't disagree with you. I do think that there's some good questions to ask, but I will tell you right now, this is a community presentation. We're doing it to be informational, and we don't know
So nobody here has the answer?
We don't work for FEMA. No, we don't have the answer. We don't know how FEMA did
Can I
it.
just make one more comment? They didn't raise it. The datum changed, so it automatically went up a foot. But each area is different. It's not going to be up 3 feet here and 3 feet in McCoy.
I get that.
It's different everywhere. They did a model based on the Cape, not on your property.
Yeah.
Actually, you're next, Mr. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. Right now, I'm on a flood. I pay flood insurance. And you've heard, reading in the newspaper, and what's alarming is, you know, even if you had flood insurance, and I'm in a flood zone, that the rates are going to go up astronomically. And you were just talking about $500, okay, on a piece of property. Well, that's not astronomical. And I'm just wondering, are these rumors true? How do we find out how, if I've got flood insurance now, how much more am I going to pay than I already am paying?
When was your house built?
Well, the house was built in, before 1974.
Okay.
But we added on afterwards.
Okay. When the house was built in 1974 and you added on, did you keep the same elevation?
In part of the house, yes, and part of the
Okay.
house, no.
You're going to be impacted more so than if it were built after 1974.
Okay.
Some of the rate samples I have here, it's not a very big increase, but again, those are for mostly the properties built after 1974. And there's a couple of things going on here which we didn't mention. First of all, there's been a rate increase that already went into effect October 1. Okay, so that's one aspect, and what they're saying is that if your house was built before 1974 and it's a secondary residence, you're going to see 25% rate increases every year until it becomes actuarially sound. That's for your current flood maps today. The new flood maps that Town of Falmouth, I believe, is going to be like June 16th of this year, where the towns are going to accept the new flood maps. Then those ratings, which are going to go into effect, and that's a different set of ratings. But just current ratings, the rates are going up. Again, the properties built after 1974 are less impacted quite a bit.
This lady with the vest.
I'm assuming this is a flood map I'm looking at?
Yep.
Yes.
Could you explain what I'm looking at?
Yes.
And secondly, is this what I would be looking at if I go to the town website?
Yes.
Okay. So what am I looking at?
So what you're looking at here is, here we are right here where the hand is. This is the West Falmouth Library. Now across the street, where you see the yellow here, that's an A zone. There's actually two A zones there, the A zone 17 and the A zone 15, separated by this green line. So if you're on the A zone 15, base flood elevation, you would have to meet standards above 15 feet. You would have to bring in mechanicals or any other mitigating factors above 15 feet. And velocity zone, well, that's, that gets into something even.
The velocity zone is the red.
Is the red. That means you're also not only in a flood zone where the standing water will come up, you also have wave action.
On lot number 102, the house appears to be on dry land. Right, it's elevation.
Yeah.
So is that in or out of a flood zone?
It's out.
It's high. So that
It's
house,
high. It's high.
so that house doesn't need to get an
Well,
elevation certificate?
According to this map, if that was my house and part of my land was in the flood map, I would get the elevation certificate.
And even if
You
it's,
would get it.
Yes, I would.
even if it's not, they might want, your insurance agency and your bank might want you to get it, just
to
because it's so close.
cover everybody.
And how much does an elevation certificate cost?
We have some land surveyors in the back.
Do we have a land surveyor here?
I saw one.
Come forward, young man. I hope you brought some business cards, pal.
Well, you made it tonight.
You made to join the Falmouth Value Trust. Okay, he will not get trapped.
My name is Michael Borselli, and I own Falmouth Engineering.
Okay, so the question is, what does elevation certificate cost?
It varies, but a budget number would be $500 to $1,000, depending on the situation at your property.
And if you had, when is the date, you said there was a date that you, after the, before that date, you would have to, and after,
What's 1974, Douglas?
Approximately.
No. Oh, okay,
Is that the only other question?
Yes.
Just a comment, it's just my understanding on the GIS.
Guys?
It's my understanding that on the GIS maps, that the actual house footprint shown aren't really accurate. So if someone's looking at the GIS and saying, well, my house isn't in it, you actually may be in it if your lot's in it.
Yes, if your lot,
That's what we just said.
yeah, if your
Well,
lot,
no, but when she was saying, well, you know, I'm definitely not in it, it's just.
yeah, I mean, you know, what you should do is you should first look at the town website, and if it's concerning, then you should probably go down and speak with one of our nice people here at the town, and if they say, yes, I'd be concerned too, then you need to call Michael Borselli.
You can also order what's called a flood zone determination letter, and we've done that before. You write to them and say, okay, where is this? And we've done that in the past to the NFIP. Nothing.
It's free.
It's free. The government provides that.
Yes, red shirt, orange, sorry.
Why does all the individuals have to do all of this work? Why doesn't the town certify a map that says what's real and what isn't real? Why do we all have to do this?
That seems like a business.
You would not want me to certify your property, sir. I'm not a land surveyor.
Well, we should have
So
one.
I could give you just what you could get by going to the map. And this is what I would give you. I'd give you a copy of that and say, this is what it looks like. However, you need to get a land surveyor to come out and actually give you an accurate survey of your property.
Yeah, I noted on the town maps, it says that there's a disclaimer on there with,
That's correct.
with reference to the accuracy and everything. Why would we even put anything out like that, with a disclaimer on it of accuracy? The damn thing should be accurate.
At this scale, it can't be accurate. That's the problem.
Why not?
Hi. I have a couple things to say. Jim Fox told me that the Cape Cod Commission has a report that talks about the feet and how the floodplain was raised in different parts of the Cape. John, so you might want to check that out. Their site is Cape Cod Commission. I think you can just Google Cape Cod Commission. And they have a lot of resources, and it's a very informed site. I would ask that everybody in this room, please be polite. Thank you. Yes, sir. The red.
I'll be very polite.
Good.
Just a question for Mr. Gore, if I may. We've had elevation drawings, a lot of people have had elevation drawings drawn up by civil engineers in the past for different reasons. Now the question is that a valid instrument for today, or do we have to do the same thing over again? Because the house hasn't changed, the property lines haven't changed. Granted, the water level's a little higher by 2 to 4 feet, but the elevation of the house is still the same. So do we have to go through this expense? Maybe that's a good question. Or if we had it done by a competitor to him, is it less expensive to go back to the first guy who might already have this preliminary work done? We can be sure of that.
That was a lot of questions.
I'm sorry. I was polite.
You're very polite. You can do a lot.
Typically, when someone comes in and they have a certified plot plan already, and say they want to put another addition on, they are required to go back and have that addition located on the property with the setbacks and all of that. Typically, I will tell them that you should go back to the individual who did the first survey, if they're still around, and have them continue, because they already have they have the baseline, and in most cases, they have it on file. So yes, you're always better to go back to the individual who did it initially than to start all over again. Now, as far as your other part of your question was? No, there's two different things here. One is a certified plot plan. And what that does is that tells us where the structure is on the property in relation to the setbacks. The other is an elevation certificate. That's different. The elevation certificate is done by the land surveyor, but it is looking at the structure itself in relation to the flood zone. So if you're in a flood zone and you've had an elevation certificate done some time ago, yes, you would need a current one, because now it's going to be based on the new maps. And your lowest floor is now going to change in relation to the flood zone.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, Mr. Stripes.
I'm not sure I understand how the use of fill would benefit somebody. Yeah, I've got a basement, and now from what I see, the base flood elevation with respect to my house is my basement slab. So how does bringing in fill help me out?
He just did it. I mean, he took his mechanicals out of the basement. It was a crawl space, I should say. Okay. And for whatever reason, put these vents in, and then underneath that he put some fill in. That in and of itself doesn't necessarily do a whole lot, but that's what he did.
If you have a full base fit, and when we say basement, that's enclosed space below grade on all 4 sides. If you have a walkout, that's not a basement, by definition in the building code. So if you have a basement that's enclosed on all four sides, and you find out now, because of the change in the map, that that is in the flood zone, then you could bring in fill inside the basement and bring that level up so that it's even with the grade on the outside.
Okay, but I like my basement.
That's fine. then you'll pay the premiums.
The other thing sorry, I don't take more time, but I understand somebody told me that flood insurance doesn't cover the contents in your basement anyway. So why would the basement count as an area that you're even really concerned about?
I'm not going to talk about the insurance. I'm going to talk about the building code. If you were to come in and you wanted to renovate that house, and you have a full basement, and you want to renovate, you want to do a complete renovation, and it is more than 50% of the assessed value, you will have to fill the basement. You won't have a choice. The only choice you have is not to do the renovation, or to do it in stages so that you never trigger the 50%. But once you trigger the 50%, you don't have a choice of whether you like your basement or not. It has to be filled in and brought into compliance based under the building code. Now, as far as the insurance purposes are concerned, they can answer those questions.
Wait, what about a walkout?
Okay, I'm sorry. So if you have a walkout, what the code requires is that you can't have any enclosed space below grade. So in a walkout, that lowest basement can be at grade. So it's no longer considered a basement. However, as far as your mechanicals and what you use that space for, that's where the building code says it can only be used for building access, parking, or storage. So you could not have habitable space down there. You couldn't have your mechanicals, your electrical, and all of that. So again, if you came in with that situation and you wanted to renovate your home and you triggered the 50%, then whatever you have down there is going to have to be removed, other than for storage. And then anything you have down there in terms of walls and materials have to be water resistant or waterproof. So you could finish, theoretically, portions of that basement for storage, but the materials that you would use would be water resistant. But you could not have your mechanicals, your electrical panel would have to be elevated, your heating system and all of that would have to be out of the flood zone, wherever that is. Now, it may not be out of the basement because depending on where the floor is, you may only be up 2 feet or 3 feet in that basement, and the rest of it is fine. You could have your mechanicals, up there. Okay, so it's a case by case, but if you have a walkout, that's different than if you have an enclosed basement.
Okay, John Boke's going to say a few things about that. Here we go.
This is kind of what everybody's looking at right here. This is what everybody's looking at right here. So when they're basing insurance premiums, they're basing it off the base flood, and if you hit click next, they're taking the top of the bottom floor. So if the base flood elevation is here, and the top of your bottom floor is above or equal to, then you're going to get a very, very favorable rate. So same with, so this is a basement, and that's just a slab. So it's built at grade, to answer your question. So you've got your basement, and then if you hit click next, if the base flood elevation is above the top of your bottom floor, you are going to pay an increase in rates. So by filling your basement to be equal to or above the base flood elevation on the new level, you will then get all your discounts and credits back on the flood insurance. So that's the benefit of doing it this way, by raising it. A slab, you're just going to be in trouble. You're just going to have to lift it up to be at base flood. Does that make sense? A little clearer?
Yes. Okay, Chris, and then Ralph.
I'm going to stand up because I have a little space around me. My house was built in 1888 by a boat builder. It was built like a ship and set on a crawl space, lifting up the house for about 2 feet on granite blocks. Now, as far as I know, and I've lived with it not 100 years, but close to it, no hurricane or flooding of any sort has ever come near it. Now, there's some minor flood insurance in my home insurance, but am I forced legally to increase the flood insurance on the house unless I want to get a mortgage or sell it or add to it? Or can I just hope for the best? And if there's a flood, maybe the house will float around. And we can all sit in it. We can swim most of us.
Well, good, I'll be over, because my house is in it, and it's gone. And it was built by a shoemaker, so I'm in charge.
But can I be forced legally to get a higher flood insurance? If I have
No.
flood?
No, if you don't have, my understanding is if you don't have a lien or a loan or a home equity line on the property, so you don't owe anybody any money,
No.
you can take that risk yourself. They owe you money. Okay, then you can take that risk yourself.
Okay, thank you very
Yep.
much.
Yeah, it would be hard to sell, but okay, here, Ralph.
Yeah, if you have to have flood insurance because of one of those reasons, is there a deductible on flood insurance that allows the owner to share the risk? There it is.
The question was, can you get a higher deductible to reduce your premium so the owner shares in some of the risk? Obviously, yes. We can go a $50,000 deductible if you're interested, but part of the issue is, what does the bank allow you? And you maybe want to speak to that a little bit, but it's up to your mortgage length. Typically, I don't think you can go higher than $5,000. Yeah, okay, $5,000. Yeah, a lot of them start at $1,000 of the deductible. You can go $2,000, $5,000, whatever.
Anybody? Yes? You? Again? Uh-huh. Yep.
I do have three clarifying questions.
Okay.
Really quick.
Okay.
My understanding of the difference between homeowners insurance and flood insurance with respect to water is that homeowners insures water damage from the inside of the house, and flood insurance insures damage from the outside of the house.
He's asking the question, the difference between a homeowner's and a flood policy. In general, a homeowner's policy, I know everyone here has probably read your homeowner's policy a couple of times, is that right? I find that the only time people read insurance policies is when they have a claim. It's like, oh, do I got coverage here? It's like the worst time to read it. A homeowner's policy will say that we cover you against risks of direct physical loss. That's what it says. We cover you against risks of direct physical loss. That's great. That falls into a multitude of things that are covered. And then it goes, except. And then you got to read what it doesn't cover. And they'll go into some detail about what they don't cover pertaining to flood. And they're very specific about that. So they don't cover it. And this definition here is flooding. It's an external. But torrential downpours, which people don't think about, even though you're not next to the river or next to an ocean, but you can be in a flat land area where there may be a hill and the water comes rushing down and floods you out. That would be a flood. In essence, to your question, we're going to cover you for flood if you have a freeze up in the home, the pipes, and this happens all the time. It's like, oh no, we get really cold weather in the beginning of December. I just know my phone's going to ring off the hook with freeze up claims, and they actually have been my worst claims of freeze-ups because you end up buying a house. You know, particularly if it's on the second floor. Pipes burst, people aren't there, the water runs out, they're concerned about mold and everything else. You're gutting it. That's what we end up doing, and it's very expensive. So your homeowners is going to pay that. Okay, and anything that's from what I will call your mechanical devices inside the property that happen to burst and break, we're paying that under a typical homeowner's policy.
Second for Mr. Gore. Did I understand that the B zones are a higher risk than the A zones?
Yes.
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
So the A zone is just the actual flooding, the water rises. The V zone, the water rises, but then you have the velocity waves in addition to that.
That's not the old B zone.
V. V as in Victor, yes.
Okay, yep, and third question.
banking point of view.
Addie, yep.
If, do I need flood insurance if I have a home equity loan that's underwritten solely by the bank and not underwritten through FEMA or through Freddie Mac or Fannie Mac?
I am going to say you most certainly will.
Is that,
local
is that
lender.
for all
If it's not a
financial
private, if
institutions?
it's a private institution or a private lender, you may not need it.
It's credit.
Credit union is going to require it.
So is that a requirement of FEMA, or would that be a requirement of the financial institutions?
It's a requirement of the Flood Insurance Act.
Okay.
So it's those
All right.
three entities that all put their minds together and decided how they're going to implement this.
So I promise after I say this one last thing, I'll sit down and never talk
Okay,
again.
this is it for you.
Just a
So
matter
it's
of...
really
and-
FDIC is
and-
what's making
All right.
I
it.
may sound awful cynical, and at a young age, I'm probably way ahead of my time. But I think these zone changes have less to do with flood, weather, etc., and more to do with the $30 billion
You got it.
that the National Flood Insurance Program is in debt. If I understood correctly, it was since like 1974, and my math is correct, it's like our federal government, that program in our federal government has lost $667 million every year since the time they've been in charge. That's the problem.
Okay. I'd like to pick someone who, yes, Rob, yes, come hither.
There are grandfathering provisions in bigger waters, correct? If you already have flood insurance, for example, to what extent are you grandfathered as long as you don't change your property?
If it's a primary home, there is some grandfathering provisions, but they're going away. In essence, if you're a primary residence, you can think about the government trying to do the voting bloc a favor. So if you have a home, you're on the water, it's your primary residence, you're in a flood zone, they're trying to treat you with kids' gloves as best as possible, realizing that you do vote. There's a 25% rate increase. But if I were to go buy your property and you say, well, gee, I already have flood insurance and it's grandfathered, I'll just transfer it to you. You can't do that. And I'm going to have to start out new. So somebody who has a primary residence, yes. If it's a secondary home, no. So the primary residence gets a little bit of a favor there for now.
Okay, I'd like to hear from people who have not asked questions. You, yes, Mr. Handsome.
Thank you. My question is, if I were to have a house and I had to upgrade to reduce my premium, what are the chances of FEMA coming up with another map 5 years down the road, and what I did before now is void and I have to redo it again to 1 or 2 feet up or something? Like, is it, excuse me?
Does anyone want to answer that question?
There's no guarantee, but the last time they had a change was over 20 years, so it's not likely that there's going to be one within 5 years. But 70s, I think it was.
Okay, and then there was a woman back here who had, yes, yep.
So I'm a first-time homeowner. I just bought my home in Falmouth. And
Congratulations.
Thank you. I so love it. Everybody's been so welcoming. Great. And of course, I have a 30-year mortgage now, so I have a whole bunch of questions. So how, it kind of goes on with what you were just saying. I wondered how often, at $500 to $1,000 for this, for the elevation certificate, how often do you need to get an elevation certificate? And also, when does it need to be done? Because I just bought the home. Should I be rushing out and getting it tomorrow, or is there a timeline? And I'm just wondering when it needs to be purchased. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, I guess my first question would be, did you have one done when you purchased the house?
What's that?
The elevation certificate?
No, I never heard of that.
Okay, are you in the flood zone?
I don't know.
Okay, so that's the first thing you can do. You can find out whether you're in the flood zone, and we can, you can either come to the building department or go on our website, and we can tell you whether or not you're in the flood zone based on the maps. If you are in the flood zone, then I would wait until the new maps become effective, and then you have a elevation certificate. If the house was built recently, then you should be fine. The house should be in compliance. because even if it was changed, you should still be in compliance in terms of most of the requirements of the flood zone.
Okay, and when is that going to happen? Did you say, is that February?
The last we heard as of today was February 7th, we're expecting a letter, and then 6 months from that would be the effective date of the new maps.
All right, thanks very much.
What's your address?
Can I just add to that, only because you're a first-time home buyer and I don't want you to go out there and spend money you don't need to spend yet. These aren't going into effect until, we think, the 16th of July, June? 7th of August, it keeps getting pushed off. In your closing documents, there would have been a notice that would tell you if you were or were not in the flood zone when you purchased the house. You can check on these, but until you get a nice little letter from your bank telling you you need to obtain flood insurance, I wouldn't go out and spend the money on the elevation
I think I
certificate.
might not need it.
I don't think you do.
Well, it's about time someone's happy back there. Okay, John, are you going to behave? You can ask the question.
I will behave, and this is a new subject.
Oh,
and
double whammy.
Something Eladio may be able to answer, but I believe I'm correct that in the last year or two, the Conservation Commission arbitrarily raised the limits up a foot, unlike any other town in Massachusetts. Does this affect what we've been talking about tonight?
Okay, there's two questions in that one question. Under the state building code, which is what I go by, I don't go by what conservation determines. In a velocity zone, you're required to build 2 feet above whatever the elevation is. So if the elevation, for example, there in that velocity zone is, this one here, the V zone, is V15, then your lowest structural member, if you were building in that zone, would be at 17. 2 feet above, based on the state building code. Conservation have their own regulations in terms of where they're going to let you build. It's got nothing to do with the actual construction. So they're saying that you're in a velocity zone at elevation 17, or, in other words, they're saying you've got to build 2 feet above. That's their requirement. It's not a building code requirement. And I only enforce the building code. But in the velocity zone, the building code says you must build 2 feet above whatever that elevation is. In an A zone, it says that your lowest floor must be at or above whatever the basement elevation is.
Good answer. It means that this could be a factor.
Yes.
Okay, so no one oh, do you have a question? The
Yes.
paper? Yes? Oh, by the way, let's all thank FCTV. They're going to, I hope, edit this a little bit. And then they're going to make it available for us. Yes, great. And they're going to make it available for folks online. I'll talk to Deb Rogers to figure out if it will be on the FCTV site or on my site with links, but we'll let you know. And again, if you sign your email address and your name, and please try to write clearly.
Where?
In the back, on that bookcase back there, near those beautiful paintings. We'll follow up with you. Okay, go ahead, your question.
Two questions that occurred to me during the discussion. The bank industry has been here and has been forthcoming, telling about some of the implications. What about, and the woman who mentioned just recently buying a house, real estate industry. They're required, she said she wasn't aware of the availability or the necessity for having the elevation certificate. And also, somewhat related to that, what about businesses? There are a large number of them that specialize in basement renovations. And should they are they required to let the homeowner be aware of, the implications of any potential renovation too, and whether they're in a compliant area?
It sounds to me like, I don't know that any of us can answer what a realtor would say to somebody, but it's a closing doc question.
One of the things you pay for now when you do apply for a mortgage is a flood zone certification. And the bank is required by law to notify you 10 days prior to the closing whether or not that property is or is not in the flood zone. So the lenders are pretty vigilant about staying on top of that. I think that's...
But the real estate not necessarily. Yeah.
With regard to construction in the basement, first of all, you should make sure that whoever you hire as a contractor gets a permit. And as part of that permitting process, we will determine whether or not it's a flood zone. We'll ask for that information. And if it is in the flood zone, then we will address all of those issues. You may not be able to finish your basement if you're in the flood zone. That's maybe why you don't ask for a permit. But if you ask for a permit, we will help determine whether or not you're in the flood zone and whether or not that construction should go forward.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question, and I can't believe no one's asked it. So say you live in a house that was built in 1840. It's very cute. It's been in your family since the 70s. Everybody likes it. And suddenly you're in the floodplain. And suddenly you do owe some money on it. And you're going to need flood insurance. Say you have an elder parent that you'd like to build a first floor master bedroom for. And last but not least, you're in the historic district. What do you do? Somebody's going to be mad at me, right?
Well, first of all, is the house on the National Register? That's one thing, because you do have some protections if it is, in terms of not having to elevate it. However, we're talking about a lateral addition. If you're putting on a lateral addition, you may be subject to the building code requirements. So you may have to elevate the lateral addition, which might require you having some steps up to the lateral addition. Again, it would be a case by case depending on where you are, what flood zone you're in, what the elevation is on the ground, and what elevation you then have to go to.
Okay.
But it doesn't mean you can't do it, it just means it's going to be problematic,
As I
but
thought.
not impossible.
Okay, thanks.
Kind of defeats the purpose of the one-floor living idea, but okay. Yes, sir, in the best.
Question, FEMA puts this flood map into effect in February as far as they're concerned, and then the town approves it in June?
No.
Is that by town meeting that they approve this?
Okay, two separate questions. One is, FEMA is going to send a letter saying that the maps are official. They become effective in 6 months from that letter date. The town, and that's to allow cities and towns the time to adopt the program. You're not adopting the maps. It doesn't matter whether Falmouth likes the maps or dislikes the maps are the maps. What you're adopting or what you're opting into is into the program that allows you to get subsidy and the insurance. So if Falmouth decides not to adopt that or not to opt into that, then there won't be any flood insurance for anyone in Falmouth under that program. You can get it elsewhere at a very high premium. So Falmouth, in all likelihood, is going to accept that and go into the insurance program. So that's whatever happens at town meeting is basically a rubber stamp. It's not an endorsement of the maps. It's not an acceptance of the maps. The maps are the maps. As far as the building code is concerned, it doesn't matter whether the town of Falmouth goes into the insurance program or not. Once those maps become effective, those maps are tied to the building code. And so I have to then enforce any construction based on the new maps once they become effective.
Okay, I'd like to still hear, is there anyone who hasn't asked a question that wants to ask a question? Yes, in the back, the lovely Karen Acton. Come forward, please. No one can hear you. Is there a differential with your coverage between primary and secondary homes? I know the answer. Yes.
When you say coverage, you just be a little more specific.
FEMA, we have, everyone's building an ark. We have a second home. Are they covered?
FEMA is a second home coverage. If you buy flood insurance, it would be covered. If you buy the coverage. And the difference between the primary and the secondary home is that if your house is grandfathered and is built before 1974, and I'm using that as an approximate date. There's some grandfathering if it's your primary home, and you've had flood insurance in effect. It's grandfathered.
What precipitated my question was, during one of the last hurricanes in Florida, there were people with a very rude awakening who thought they were covered when in fact it was their second home, be it a condo or a single-family home. They found out, in fact, they were not covered because the property was designated as the second home.
Not
occupied.
They actually define secondary residence by 80% of 365 days. So if you reside in the residence in Falmouth, 80% of 365 days, they consider that your primary residence.
And that's you or your wife. It has to be only one of them.
Let me just say this about
I'm going to Florida.
I don't have specifics on what you're talking about. Let me just say this in general. When you think about insurance policy, all they are legal contracts. They're written. They've got conditions, they've got exclusions, and so forth. And typically, if they state that your property is insured, and it says it's insured, you read through the exclusions and it's not excluded, you have the coverage. I'm not familiar with what you're talking about, where somebody you're telling me bought a secondary, had a house, it was a secondary home, they bought flood insurance, and the flood insurance didn't pay during a flood because they said it was a secondary home?
Was a condo complex. Yeah. You know, they were calling for the blue tarps. And
Was it a federal flood insurance program, or was it a private flood insurance program?
that I'm not specific.
Yeah, because you can buy, there is private, it's expensive, it depends, but I haven't heard what you said about, so I can't talk intelligently about that, I just haven't heard that. Have you, John?
No, I have not.
Yeah. If you buy flood insurance, and they know, you know, it's full disclosure, right? Material representation, you materially represent the facts to the insurer during the underwriting process, this is what it is, and you have a flood, they gotta pay the claim. Same thing, condo complex, that doesn't matter. I mean, condo, residential, if they buy flood insurance, unless something was materially misrepresented at the time of underwriting. But
Okay. Okay, red
Since
jacket.
we're on the topic of condos, if you're in an association, some people are carrying a mortgage and some are not, is the bank going to require that the outside is covered by flood insurance? And along those lines, my second part is the notification process. I know that Rockland Trust had a letter about that. Are you notifying people starting at the 6 months? When is the 30 days in effect, et cetera? Can you talk about, at least with your bank, what you're planning to do?
First, just to touch on the condo question, they're all different, depends on the condo association and what type of insurance they have in place. So they will have to have flood insurance in almost every instance. You may want to have content insurance for the flood specifically. Correct, John? That's right. That, we're not as concerned with that as we are with the condo association and the policy that they're carrying on the entire property. Right, so that's the first question. Second question is, when are you going to get this lovely letter? Right, because we're all stressing over this too, because you can understand, we're servicing all these mortgages and we're saying, how are we going to manage to do this? And how are we going to notify these people? How are we going to educate that we don't have any discretion about it? And I'm not happy because I've been doing this for 25 years and I don't want to send all my clients letters and get them all upset. So what we're anticipating at this point is, once it's adopted and it becomes, well, I should say adopted because it's going to become adopted, but as long as the town agrees to go into it so that we can get the National Flood Insurance Program insurance policies written, we're going in. If the town does not adopt it, then you will have to get private flood insurance from an alternative source, which will be a lot more costly in most cases. But we're still required to make you get the insurance, or to make sure you get the insurance, okay? So once we're officially in that mode, we're going to be sending out letters to all of our borrowers, probably within, I would like to say 4 weeks. I imagine it'll be closer to 6 weeks. It's a matter of just getting it all processed. And then we expect to give you 45 days to obtain the insurance. So,
That's from the town date in the summer.
right, so I would say in most cases, if you think you're gonna need it, you're probably gonna have it probably no later than October, right?
Okay. Douglas says,
How many here live in a condominium? Yeah, as you know, if you have condominium, you have bylaws. Have you ever read them? It's typically the insurance. They'll say that, you know, what the association is responsible for insuring. And typically, there's one of three provisions. It's all in, means that the condo association is responsible for insuring the entire physical structure, including all the improvements. And the other one you'll hear is original specifications. However, the property was originally built, and the improvements are the responsibility of the unit owner. And then the third one you'll see is from the bare walls. Most of them I run up against are all in. So if you have a condominium association, they would be the ones responsible for the building coverage on the flood component. And as Addie mentioned, your personal property inside, you just buy a coverage for contents only, which is different than buying contents and building.
What about bare walls?
What about it?
Is that handled differently than all?
Well, bare walls then would mean any improvements you've made to the structure. So if you put in, so I was saying bare walls, sheetrock only. So if you happen to put in the bathroom fixtures and the kitchen and the carpeting and that type of stuff, let's just say it's $100,000. And we look at that as something you'd want to insure because that's your responsibility. You'd insure that on the flood policy.
Okay, guess what? The party's over. If anyone has any questions or follow-up requests, remember to sign out as you leave. I hope this was informative and educational.